As the Russian invasion began, a team of Ukrainian journalists was trapped in the besieged city of Mariupol. The searing and harrowing film 20 Days in Mariupol documents their struggle to continue working to record the war's atrocities under the brutal assault of Russia's army. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please do like, share, and definitely comment so we can help more and more people discover this fantastic guest that we feature. It's never been more important for that to happen as it is now, as we come up to the second anniversary of Russia's invasion. And that's one of the things we're going to be discussing today with Tetyana Denford. She is a Ukrainian-American fiction author, translator for Frontline PBS, freelance writer, as well as a YouTube channel host with 20 plus years history of working in the writing and editing world. Her first novel, self-published in 2020 as Motherland, has been republished in July 2022 with the team at Hatchet. And of course, we will put links to that. The Child of Ukraine, it's called. We'll put links to that in the description of the video. And I'm delighted to welcome you back to the channel for the second time, Tetyana.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here as usual.
And you have involvement, of course, with the 20 Days in Mariupol. We'll talk about the impact it's making in a minute, but for those who aren't familiar with it, let's just go through your role in that film and really the sort of genesis of it, how it came about, how it came to be made. Because I think this, if people haven't seen it, this is making a huge impact.
Yeah, and we're the team. All of us who worked on it are really proud of it. I have been working with Frontline since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And they hired me to be a translator of the Ukrainian language. And that movie, the documentary that came out, is called The Battle for Ukraine. And it basically goes behind the scenes as to what was happening on the Maidan. And it was, at the time, people didn't really understand what Ukraine was standing up for, where Ukraine really was on the map even. They didn't understand Ukrainians. And it kind of delves into kind of a little bit of the corruption of the government at the time and why students in particular were the ones that were out on the Maidan saying enough is enough. And since then, they've called me up whenever they needed me as a translator. So when the war began in 2022, the producers emailed me and said, okay, we need you because we're doing a documentary in particular about Mariupol. And they needed me on call basically. So most of 2022, I spent countless hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, editing some footage and translating the Ukrainian language. And it was very, very harrowing work. I mean, I'm not comparing it to what Mstislav and Yevgeny had to smuggle out of Mariupol at the time, but it was the honor of my life to have worked on that film. And to work with a very dedicated team of translators and producers. So yeah, it was, I saw the premiere in New York and it's funny, when I saw the raw footage that was being sent to me, I thought, that left kind of, there were things that I saw that I never thought I'd ever see in my entire life, and I probably will never see again. It left kind of emotional scars. And then when I saw it saw the premiere in New York, and Mstislav and I were having a chat, and it was just reliving that again, the way it was put together. And I just saw the pain in his face, and he gave me a hug, and it's kind of, we all bonded through that. I would like to say, it sounds so trite. I completely get what that sounds like, but you are connected when you go through trauma with somebody. And I will forever be connected to Mstislav and Michelle, the producer. And yeah, it was quite horrifying. But
Because you saw the raw footage, so when it's edited up, I mean, it's traumatic enough. It's taken me 5 sittings to watch 20 Days in Mariupol, because I just, it's too much to watch, you know, end to end. If I'm honest, I think a lot of other people have said the same. Even those who've been on the front line, and I've seen it, have said they just find it such an emotional impact. But you're seeing the raw footage. I mean, in some ways, that must be even harder, because it just, you get the full reality of it.
Yeah, I mean, here's the weird bit, and I think maybe I'm a bit of a masochist like this. Because I have family still currently living through this war, I felt kind of helpless as to what I could do. Donations, fine. Checking in on them, fine. Making sure like I could do what I could do to help. But when this was dropped on my desk and I could work with Frontline again, I just felt like that was my effort. That was what I could do. And I think somebody said that I was probably experiencing secondhand PTSD. And again, I don't want to inflate this kind of trauma, because compared to people living through this war, I mean, I feel lucky in so many ways. But it really affected me mentally. I remember seeing certain footage, and people who have seen the movie, there are certain scenes that I had to translate that were of children dying on a gurney and the parents standing there helpless. And I think I had to just numb myself to that. And you compartmentalize, you realize it's just a job. It's just a job. I'm doing my job. I'm doing the best I can to help. And I think it all hit me towards the end of the year, after I'd submitted all my edits and the footage, and kind of we were taking a break, and I broke down. I think I had a really tough period where I was quite manic, in a daze, you know, but now people are kind of witnessing the truth, and all of that was weirdly worth it, I guess. It's a very strange thing to say, and it's a very strange job to have to do, but I am hugely honored and grateful that they trusted me to do that.
And it is incredibly important, isn't it? Because one of the lines jumped out at me in the film, and that is only a few days into the siege of Mariupol, and the journalist is saying, you know, we decided to stay with the ambulance crew, and now all the foreign press are gone. So you really get this sense of almost abandonment. So people who are prepared to stay and do that job, it's absolutely vital, because without recording it, there's almost benefits the amnesiac quality of Russian propaganda. If no one's there to see it, it didn't happen.
Didn't happen. And here's the most amazing, and I still get goosebumps talking about this. When I received footage that included oh my gosh, what was his name? The police officer who helped the team and they were in the hospital, and he said, right, I'm going to get my guys to help you get the footage out. I had to translate what he was saying in Ukrainian to the camera. He was making a statement, and in Ukrainian is zvorushulo. It's like it made me feel undone to watch this man say, I am going to protect the journalists and the footage, as opposed to protecting the people stuck in the hospital. And to have to make that horrific decision in that moment, you know, he basically protected the truth. Now, some people might find that really problematic, because you're trying, you have a job to protect these people who are stuck in the hospital, but they might die anyway. like, what an awful decision to have to make. But the fact that he managed to finagle a way to help the journalists get the footage out of Mariupol was just extraordinary to me.
And it's a complex
He
moral
was so
calculation, isn't it?
committed.
You know, we
Yeah, it's
might
nuts.
save many more lives by getting the footage out than we can here physically, you know, one-on-one.
Yeah. But imagine having to be in that moment. And I think in the past on social media, I have discussed the gray areas of war. It's very, very difficult for people to comprehend that it's not black and white. You are forced to have to make very, very difficult decisions. I cannot imagine being in a situation where in a split second, I had to figure out and do some mental gymnastics on what to do in the next 2 minutes. Or, you know, I can't imagine what my grandparents and great grandparents had to go through, what decisions they had to make. Now it's easy for us to sit back and go, well, this is what I would have done. Would you have though? You know,
Yeah.
it's tricky. And I think that police officer, and I'm so sorry that his name is out of my head now, and I can't, but to make that decision was so brave and so right in the end, because otherwise you and I would not be talking about this right now.
And that's another thing that comes out of the film as well. Very, very early on, the journalist sort of gives advice to a civilian to hide in the basement because you'll be safer there. And then comes out with the phrase, which is very humane, very understandable in those early days. They won't go out of their way to kill civilians. You know, they're not going to be bombarding civilian areas. Within hours, that's proved wrong. And he fortunately meets up with that person, finds they've survived. But again, I guess people who are on the front line in a variety of roles, they have to face up every day to the idea that they may be making mistakes. And those mistakes may have life and death consequences for colleagues or other people, but they have to move on from that. They have to keep going, learn from mistakes, because that might cumulatively save more people in the end and not tear themselves apart from mistakes they've made. It's horrific.
You know, and I think people are understanding. I think people who have, and the movie is very triggering, and I completely understand why some people can't bring themselves to watch it. But the people who have watched it, it's a conversation then that starts about how so many people on the front lines, you know, volunteers, civilians, they're carrying this enormous weight of responsibility on how to navigate this on a daily basis. And the defenders who are lucky enough to come home to their families, I cannot imagine the trauma that these invisible scars that they will carry with them for the rest of their life. You know, and I think having this, you know, thank God we have this footage, because it's allowing people to sit in that very uncomfortable place and think about how on so many levels this situation was and is and will continue to be devastating, you know.
This is a set of stats that I've shared on the channel sort of earlier today because I found them absolutely extraordinary. And that is that 44% of all Ukrainians who are polled in this particular data set here have immediate family members who are serving. 33% have family members who are in the territorial forces. 48% report that a close friend or relative has been killed. And 31% know somebody who's under occupation. So these facts and figures are extraordinary. Oh, and 56% report that their neighborhood has been hit or suffered in some way by shelling, shrapnel, or whatever. So again, there's extraordinary figures. That means that the trauma that you're talking about is not something isolated to the front line. It's not something isolated to those who specifically have experienced, you know, directly a shaheed or something. Everybody has got some level, if not multiple levels of trauma, which at the moment, I guess, many people are just, as you say, they have a job to do and they have to keep going. But that's an extraordinary legacy of pain and mental trauma that's going to have to be dealt with.
I mean, and that's what war does, doesn't it? But I think because Ukrainians have lived with these stories, so many similar stories in their families, most Ukrainians have so many stories like this, that they've grown up with. And I think, it leaves ripples, it leaves echoes, and future generations of children will be scarred by this in some way. There have been babies born in bomb shelters or while shelling is happening. We saw it in the documentary. There are children being taught in bomb shelters, and they're being conditioned to hear air raid sirens and adjust their lives to include that, which is incomprehensible to me.
And I think what a lot of people don't also realize, because the war really hit the headlines in February of 2022, but I don't think people realize the scale of the fighting and the changes, the internal changes in Ukrainian society that were needed to deal with the assault since 2014. But there are people on the front lines now, many tens of thousands of them, who are school children, young school children, when this kicked off. So this is a kind of, this isn't just something that sort of happened in the last 2 years. This is so-called described, eternal warfare, the forever war.
Yeah. And I think, there's a kind of, and I'm learning to hate this word, resilience, because Ukrainians shouldn't have to be resilient and patient and forgiving and hopeful all the time, because it just adds layers and layers and layers on top of what they already have to carry. But I think it does, unfortunately, create a layer of thick skin almost for Ukrainians to have to somehow live a life where they have to act normal while they also brace themselves. Part of their insides, part of their emotions have to kind of prepare themselves for something, for a change in their day, to check in and make sure that, somebody in their family hasn't died, to make sure that they are protecting their children and making them live as normal a life as possible. All of that is just creating scar tissue almost that they have to carry with them. And that's really sad, but that's the reality, And I think the more people realize that, the more maybe patient they would be with Ukrainians to kind of stop and listen and hold space, instead of, like a lot of people do on social media nowadays, they don't listen, they wait to speak, and then they shout everybody down because they think that shouting louder means that they're right. So I think the more people realize the layers of trauma, the layers of responsibility, the layers that Ukrainians have to go through in order to live their lives more now than ever, the more I think maybe, hopefully, people will stop. And instead of forming an immediate opinion and a knee-jerk reaction, they can just wait and go, okay, right, I need to learn from this a little bit.
And I think when we spoke last time, and you talk about Ukrainians being sort of, I think one of the words you used was sort of stubborn and forceful and so on. I'd almost counter that to say that actually, given the circumstances and given what Ukrainians know, what they've experienced, and their deep understanding, I would say, of the Russian mindset, there is actually a little too much humility rather than the opposite. And that seems to me, as I after being in Ukraine in August, and obviously speaking to many people, it does strike me that humility is a key component of the Ukrainian identity, and this is one of the reasons why it has been subsumed by Russia, because Russian Orthodoxy talks about humility being a key component of your psychological makeup. But as I recall interactions with many Russians and living there, humility is not a feature of the culture.
It's seen as a weakness.
Yes.
Which is hilarious. And I think probably a year ago when you interviewed me, I was probably really angry. So I was like, no, we're all feisty. We're scrappy. We'll figure it out. Whereas I think, we all grow and learn and change over time. You know, people in the diaspora are living through this very differently than people in Ukraine. And I think initial reactions can be a lot of anger and frustration, and we're willing to do whatever it takes in order to amplify whoever needs to be amplified. And I think time allows for us to see a lot of different facets of our culture and our people and our history. And you're right about the humility. I think we get offended now when people see that as some kind of weakness, or, you know, like we're pushovers. I think we see a lot of goodness, even through our anger. There's still so much in Ukraine that is good, and in the Ukrainian, in the people, and the, you know, how we kind of present ourselves. And I think that's why sometimes when people get on social media and start talking about certain problematic areas of the government in Ukraine, or there are a lot of Ukrainians who are saying, yeah, every country has its problems, but right now, especially during war, during genocide, the most important thing we can focus on is not only how to help, but how to see hope, how to see that Ukrainians are still working, still living their lives, still inventing things and creating, you know, robotic parts for amputees. And they are innovative, and they are humble, and they are passionate people, you know. And I think that's way more important right now, because that's what gives traction to the amplification. That's what allows people to have the energy of positivity going, come on, let's just keep helping, keep doing this. You know, we need that. Otherwise, the typical human kind of war fatigue is really going to set in, especially this year, when there are so many things shifting. We're like, no, let's keep going. We have to keep that sentiment, you know.
We'll turn back to the documentary in a minute, but one question that also comes out of that, and I think this is a really key component of what's been going on, of course, Zelenskyy is an incredible communicator, both internally and externally. And certainly he seemed to be winning the oratory in year one of the war. There has subsequently been criticism, again, both internally and externally. But it's interesting to see what that is. There's a certain amount of, I dare say it, inevitably in wartime, you know, there are disagreements which can, you know, become a little more public. But of course, Russia's amplifying those. So that's sort of going on within Ukraine. Externally, there's a very different dynamic. And this is one which I think is quite interesting, because another characteristic, it strikes me, of Ukrainians is really no tolerance for sort of BS or doing things for a symbolic value or ticking boxes or just because it's diplomatic and so on. And, you know, you're polite, but you're not going to go through some kind of rigmarole just for the sake of it to make someone feel better. And I think it's a certain intolerance with the, and rightfully so, a sense of urgency and tolerance for the kind of BS of international diplomacy. And when support falls short of what is required for victory, but is enough to kind of tick a box and virtue signal for Western governments, the media are like, isn't this great? And, you know, Zelenskyy and others they're telling the truth. This is not enough. Do better. And they're labeled as emotional and pushy and greedy and whatever.
You know, in general, in life, but especially during a war, who has time for BS? Honestly, like, we have more important stuff to do. Come on, you know. And I think that's generally, if I get together and have dinner with Ukrainians, we're not going to kind of cuddle and you know, say, oh, poor me, and, you know, how are you feeling? Is everything okay? You know, we're the kind of people that are like, right, so this is happening. What else is going on in your life? You know, it's one of those things where you have to just get on with it. And I think a lot of us get frustrated with the pandering that happens in the media, especially the articles that are coming out now in a lot of huge kind of platformed newspapers. because everybody likes to play this little, let's tiptoe around it, and everybody wants to be diplomatic, and they play the kind of double talk game. And we do not have time for that. We need the truth. We need something to be very black and white. If you're not going to help, get out of the way. We need to make sure that we have the international community on the same page. And I think that's what comes across. You know, I think people misperceive, is that even a word? I don't even know, but they do not. I think it's inaccurate, especially on social media. It's very easy to get a hot take, you know, on something. So people get very grand opinions and say, well, you're acting a little bit entitled and greedy, when actually we are just trying to communicate the truth. And it's very easy to misread something on a social media platform. It's very easy to be triggered, or, oh, you're using that word, you can't use that word. Well, how else do you want us to talk about what we need and how you can help? You know, and I think what's brilliant about Zelenskyy, now he is not above being criticized, you know, and that's okay too. And it's important actually to have somebody who's leading any country. You know, people elect these people ideally, like, except what happens in Russia, but people elect somebody to lead their country. So they should be held accountable for how they run it and what people they put into place and what their policies are. That's fine, you know, and that should be the case. But when it comes to how Zelenskyy engages an audience, he treads a very good middle ground of being honest without being arrogant. He shows a little bit of humility and sometimes humor, but also has presence, you know, and I think that is so terribly important in a world where people are craving humanity and leaders who feel human. And I think when people feel disconnected from a leader or a politician, they're really just going to go off to an extreme, you know, in what they believe and what they are fed. And this is why sometimes people get sucked into propaganda, is because propaganda sees a hole or a weakness and they go, oh, well, you don't believe in that? Let me tell you the truth, you know. And I think I am, even if I may not agree with certain things about Zelenskyy and maybe some of his policies, I think the way he's navigating is phenomenal because he's a real human being. Isn't that what we all want? Somebody who just talks to us like he gets it. You know, he is a husband, a father, somebody who is not a career politician and who's kind of approaching this in a way that's like, guys, I'm doing my best. Here's what I think we should do. And he's consistent in his message. There's no dusty double talk politician here. So it must be an extremely difficult job, obviously. But I think personally, I think it's very effective.
And of course, surrounded by career politicians who, as we've seen, you know, have a big eye on their own sort of domestic success, etc. It's a tough one to sort of cut through. The other challenging aspect, before we get on to the documentary again, is, and we're going to talk about the sort of cultural loss in the year since we last spoke. But the other one, of course, is, and what seems to be happening, is we're starting to uncover the networks of Russian influence. And as the immediacy of the war, which the documentary very effectively shows, as that immediacy fades, if the media are going to carry on covering Ukraine, they constantly need to find new angles, new stories, new ways of doing it. That, to my mind, really enhances the or amplifies the chances of distorting the truth if you're constantly not looking at reality and how can we reflect that better, but rather, here's an audience, how can we package some information up to get their attention almost irrespective of the reality? And I see more and more of that happening, including the BBC. You know, it's a product they have to create and sell and pitch. And what we're also seeing, though, is that this is incredibly fertile territory for the implanted Russian assets and agents. And even this week, we're seeing details coming out about people with deep links to Valdai and so on, who are getting these op-eds, who are writing these big articles, who are even influencing, it seems, policymaking within the White House.
Yeah. And I do think, I remember starting the beginning of the year thinking, because of the US election, because the UK election, because of how many global elections are happening, there's going to be a shift. And it feels like media very quickly finds points of not weaknesses, but maybe even unrest or instability. And they just start creating stories to gently guide whatever audience they can for whatever message they want to get across. And I was saying so many times in the beginning, we all have to brace ourselves. You know, Ukraine is fighting and like a constant onslaught, and they are doing it in this consistent and strong and, dare I say it, like kind of humble way even. And I think the danger is that the quicker the media feeds these little stories and the quicker people turn, the danger is that people are going to start turning away. And I keep saying, like, be careful. There are people who on social media are amplifying things that if they read the article, it's inconsistent or the headline is bad, but people very easily jump on a bandwagon just because something is trending. And I think it's so dangerous. There is a level of impatience that's happening right now because people want to get ahead of the news. So they want to be the first one to amplify something, or again, do a hot take about whatever, when it's dangerous. It's dangerous because the more that happens, the more people will start kind of being distracted by all these different, very problematic ideas and headlines. And we need to kind of stay focused in our lane on the truth and how to help, you know?
And of course, the hot take is what sticks in someone's minds. The follow-up that may be more nuanced, unfortunately, rarely is, but the follow-up that may be more nuanced, detailed, factual, and present a different argument, that's, you know, social media's moved on. People have moved on. That's not the first impression that sinks in. So it's almost as if the dice are loaded towards propaganda. And since we last spoke, Kakhovka Dam is a classic story. Under coverage in the news, but what coverage there was is very much slanted to these hot takes, which really sort of fail to deal with evidence that, rather than, you know, was it Russia, wasn't it Russia, within days, more and more evidence is piling up that it was. Now we're at a certain distance of that event. I would say, strategic evidence makes it, you know, a certainty that it wasn't just like an accident or whatever. It was very carefully planned with a strong strategic intent. But of course, the media's gone. They're on to something else.
No, and the first take on that, my family was directly affected by that. And the first take on that was, well, they did it to themselves. Oh, sorry, what? But that's the thing. It leaves a dent. It leaves an impression, and then you move on, and that's what you remember. And especially in a year like this year, it's going to happen more and more. And I think it's going to be much harder work for us to just wait and go, wait, hang on. No, there are holes in this. Don't listen to that. Move this aside. It's going to be kind of wading through stuff. And I worry that people are, you know, we all have busy lives. And I think people are impatiently just sharing stuff, thinking it'll help. But that's where it gets lost. And that's where propaganda kind of digs its teeth further in. And we can't let ourselves do that. It's better to just actually not say a thing instead of just resharing something.
And this is where we come to 20 days in Mariupol, because we're 2 years in, and those who are following this have seen untold horrors, actually day by day by day, if you're really sort of paying attention. But you can become, I won't say, you know, every one of those is a crime. Every one of those is terrible and horrific, and you do feel something, but you don't feel that same kind of depth, that same kind of absolute horror that you feel the first time you see that, the first footage. And this is why I think this documentary film is so important, because it captures that sheer horror and impact and energy, the tears and trauma. You know, the surgeons all standing around, for instance, the small child who's passing in front of their eyes, horrifically, you know, wounded, with again the parent there, and of course all the doctors and surgeons are crying. I'm guessing you can't function in that role if you're going to do that every day and be emotionally affected. So people must have to just sort of deal with it.
Yeah.
But that film captures that immediate intensity. How important is it that it's coming out now, and we're close to the second anniversary, that people really sort of reconnect with the sheer horror of what's going on?
I think human nature does have fatigue more quickly than ever before when they are faced with reading things on the internet or seeing videos on social media. I think over time, it's very easy to say, well, I'm going to turn away from this because I can't handle it. I get it. It's self-preservation also. You know, you want to reserve parts of yourself that aren't traumatized so you can kind of live a normal life. Here's where I think film in particular, especially now, is hugely important, because that is always going to be a way for people to revisit, almost, if they can, the truth about certain bits of history that we would rather turn away from. And more so than, social media can implode tomorrow. The videos on there can disappear, but film lives in perpetuity. And something like this will have an effect across generations, as long as people don't see it as one of those kind of films about Ukraine. It's like the film Mr. Jones. Now, granted, that was based on a part of history, Holodomor, and how it was discovered by a Welsh journalist, but it was, dare I say, sensationalized a little bit, because, you know, it was a film that was a little bit Hollywood. And it's easy to kind of move those aside and kind of go, okay, I'm moving on. That was interesting, but I'm just going to watch something else. I think 20 Days is filmed in such a unique way. I can't even explain. I think it's the first documentary, and I know I sound biased, obviously I'm Ukrainian, but also I think it's the first documentary that I've ever seen that is narrated and filmed almost like an art piece, if that makes sense. It is beautiful, despite how heartbreaking and devastating and traumatic it is to watch. It is bringing somebody into the very middle and kind of forcing them to make the same decisions that these people are making in those moments. I don't know how they did that, but I think the human, you know, Mstislav's narration above it made it feel way more impactful than I was expecting. Yes,
very human as well, isn't it? It's
right?
like
yeah. And I think the way it was put together, the way the film was cut, and the narration and the filming and everything, it was like a combination of a violent kind of, you know, horror film, but also, like I said, an art piece and a documentary, and trying to teach people about the humans that had gone through this. It has so many layers, and I think that's why right now, fittingly, during the award circuit, people are just blown away by how it reads and how it affects people. You know, I think it's beautiful and horrifying all at once.
And that might point to perhaps one of the issues with journalism. This doesn't denigrate the work of international journalists, because a lot of fantastic work gets done. But there's always this quality of otherness, isn't there? And the journalist comes in, they're not part of that community.
Yeah.
They can leave usually at any point. Not always, but, you know, because it's high risk. but they can leave and then they go and they do the same somewhere else. There's always this sort of othering of the people that they are covering.
Yeah.
And there's this sense of distance, but also I think, probably as well, because you've got the watershed. And so you have to package the news up in a way that sanitizes it. It puts a veil, a barrier, a distance between the audience and the events that's happening. This doesn't happen in this film because, the journalist isn't standing around going, oh my God, this is terrible. But you can see and feel, at certain points, they'll simply put the camera down, but it carries on filming. And those little moments tell you so much about the mental state of the film crew without any kind of words.
I love that you just said that, because it's so easy, like you said, and it's a tough job for a journalist to kind of point their camera at something and saying, listen, I'm reporting this to you. Lucky you don't have to go through this, but here's what's happening, And I think not just, Mariupol does, like I said, it's the opposite of that. It drags you in and forces you to listen to the pain in the narrator's voice. It forces you to watch and feel helpless that you're not doing something. And maybe it pushes people after the film to say, I want to do something. It brings like an active participant in you. It brings it out and says, okay, what can I do? How can I learn from this? But also, I think part of why, there's so much happening in the world right now, and I'm not going to get into other wars, but that's why the voices that are part of the community that they are reporting from in a war, when they release their videos on social media, is way more impactful than sending a team of reporters pointing a camera and saying, we're bringing you the news. When somebody's actually there, or God forbid, their family and friends are affected by this, but they are press and they are presenting you with these horrors while also personally affected, I'm sorry, you have to have a heart of stone not to want to do something. And I think that's the future, really, as we see it. Like anytime there is a disaster, a war, some kind of humanitarian crisis, that's how we're going to get people involved, is to say, I'm a human being just like you. My family is affected. This is the pain that I feel while I'm presenting this to you. I think that is I hate to use this term because it sounds really trite, but breaking the fourth wall almost. It's just bringing people in. And I think if we don't learn how to connect with human beings on this planet, then we have nothing left. Then everything feels surface level. We have to be affected by things in order to affect change globally.
That's it. And again, not to be political, but I've seen some footage coming out of Gaza, again, very, expertly trained, impartial documentary makers, filmmakers who are filming their own communities coming under attack. And there's some of that sort of quality of immediacy. Obviously, as a problem, because there's also a lot of propaganda mixed in with there. So you have to be quite partial in, choosing an individual you trust. And I think that's a very interesting point you make here. It's no longer an outlet or a team or a particular news format. It's almost like you have to go down to the level of an individual journalist and like, I trust their voice and their voice is consistently good, or I know their strengths and weaknesses. And that's quite an interesting development.
Yeah.
Also, this film is shot over a number of weeks. And I think one thing that made a big impact on me is just the sheer visceral nature of the film, but realizing this is a small slice of experience in one city when many, many, many dozens, if not hundreds of cities and villages are undergoing sort of, similar trauma. To me, the sheer immediacy of that does create this kind of echo effect that you think, well, my goodness, that what has gone on if you multiply this over time and space. I think that's part of the impact of it.
Yeah, and I think people are realizing that now. And there's more footage that I've translated that Mstislav is probably going to come out with in the future. And I plan on working with him in Frontline on kind of future projects. But there are so many layers and tentacles of how Ukraine has been devastated by this war. And there were interviews that I translated with people that survived. There was a whole incident at Yablonska Street where people were marched into a torture chamber and witnessed things that, people would be horrified with. And I think if we appreciate and witness all of these events that are connected, rather than compartmentalizing them and saying, oh, okay, well, that was the news for today. Okay, let's move on. It's kind of building a case, hopefully, as to why the international community should try and do their best at amplifying and helping Ukraine and Ukrainians, because otherwise we have nothing left. I mean, Ukraine and Ukrainians over generations have historically been kind of passed over or, turned away from. They've been mocked in media as, people who are lowly, like cleaners or thieves and I think the more people use this, as tragic as it is, as information where they can better inform themselves as to who Ukrainians are, what the country has done over the years to contribute to the modern world. We're not some back road dumb farmers that I've heard myself. I've been called that, growing up. I think if people realize that and use this as education rather than war porn, I think that's the way we can kind of all lean in. I'm not, and it's not about asking people to constantly, be doom scrolling or constantly be traumatized, but use the time that you have when Ukraine is constantly in the news. Why don't you use some time to kind of research history, culture, which is why Ukrainian Spaces does this amazing job of like talking about activists and people who are decolonized or are in the process of trying to kind of get out of that brainwashing system because of Soviet occupation so long ago. The culture, the industry, I think use that and just try and understand who these people are, instead of using us as some kind of trending news bulletin and then turning away. It's more important than that.
And I think that's kind of emerging. Certainly people who watch this channel consistently will see that there's certain arguments emerging and certain questions I put to guests that sort of try to angle things towards taking action and also towards the justifications of why Ukraine should be supported. And I think one of the compelling ones is not support Ukraine because they're a democracy or because they're this or that, or it's a crucial location or resources or whatever. For me, it's because Ukrainians have something unique that we need to learn from. It's almost like that kind of genetic diversity. If it's lost, and we lose something within our own self-interest. And I know you are getting tired of the word resilience, but it's the innovation around countering propaganda. It's preserving national identity, culture, evolving it, despite being under, an imperial boot for several centuries, despite, the Soviet Union and the system it created was so successful at putting multiple cultures and identities as if into a vat of acid, and nothing is left of them. Almost nothing is left. And here Ukraine emerges from that vat of acid, and it's still legible, visible. It still kind of bounces back. That to me is the real miracle of it.
Yeah. And you know what? I think as humanity, we have a responsibility to turn away from propaganda, not just because of Ukraine, but because it's better for the world as a whole, surely. We don't want to be drip fed nonsense. You know, I think people are tired of being talked down to and dumbed down, thinking, oh, and maybe some people just are happy idiots and they just want to have like a fun, you know, news bulletin and then watch a Disney movie. That's okay too. But I'm saying just generally, it's not just about Ukraine. It's just about not enabling the false information just because people are in power and they are enabled to behave this way, you know. And I think it's just, it's something that Ukrainians obviously are at the forefront in having this conversation about propaganda, but we cannot be the only ones doing the heavy lifting here, you know. And we were given assurances that we would be helped, that we would be protected, which is why we signed the Geneva Convention papers. And then now we're in a position where we're asking people, hang on, can we please hold you accountable for helping us, please? Because we're in a tricky situation. And now we're being seen as, oh, well, you know, you're taking money out of our budget. Now, again, there's gray. It's not just black and white. And I really, really hope, not just because the film is coming out, the documentary, but I really hope this year is a watershed moment for how people connect in the world. And I really hope that we all turn a blind eye to propaganda, to, you know, power that is enabled too often. And I really hope we turn towards humanity, because that's what connects us all. You know, America and other countries aren't that far away from Ukraine. And it's very dangerous to think that people are cushioned from that, because who knows, we keep enabling it. How is it going to affect other countries?
I think
And
there's
yeah.
There's some green shoots there, which I think, you know, it's incumbent on anyone who is looking to push action here, and people will appreciate that. I mean, I've had conversations with people over the last 2 years, which, if it wasn't for the fact that we found commonality in supporting Ukraine, we wouldn't be having any conversations at all about anything. In fact, we might be in that kind of social media bubble where we're slinging mud at each other. So I think there is something to build upon there. You know, Brexit's been incredibly divisive. The Trump period in power has been divisive. I'm not going to say, you know, right, wrong, etc., but it was divisive. People didn't agree with each other. But what you find is, on Ukraine and on some broad issues of freedom, certain people who might have been divided into those two camps say, oh, actually, no, we can talk about certain things here. We can unite on certain things. It's not by any means universal, but it has given a little bit of hope that there's at least some foundations left that we can build upon.
Yeah.
The last area we're going to talk about, I think, is, let's angle it towards why Ukraine needs to be enabled to win faster and more decisively. But let's talk about the cultural loss, because it's been an extraordinary 2 years of actual cultural losses from across every different spectra, from writing to music to art. And there's no sign of that letting up. Just this week, a promising poet who's only released one volume has passed away on the front. Let's just go through some of the loss, but also, you know, the legacy of some of these people who will live on. One who's very sort of close to home here in the UK, because she visited, and many of the you know, literary sort of Ukrainian leading literary people here were very close friends with her, which is Victoria Amelina. But there have been many incredible voices silenced by Russia. This is, by necessity, I think, a very painful topic to touch upon, but let's talk a bit about that.
I mean, I think all death is terrible, but I think the death of a poet, writer, activist, like a creative who has used their words in a way to amplify the country they're proud of, that is an echo that is similar to so many Ukrainians who were artists, who were targeted specifically and erased. And I think that is an especially painful reminder when it happens now. You know, Victoria's death was just truly, I think, shocking. And it will leave a mark for a long time, you know, alongside the poet, bless him, who died quite recently as well, on the front. And I think it just reminds us of a very, very painful history. If you look up a lot of Ukrainian poets and authors and kind of people who believed in the beauty of their country and how they were targeted, pianists, painters, it is absolutely devastating to know that a country could single out so many beautiful souls and just any kind of beauty, just because they don't understand it and they're almost jealous of it, they have to get rid of it so nobody else can have it. And it's kind of sick, really kind of wrapping your mind around that. And I think those losses are felt quite deeply because Ukrainians are kind of used to that, knowing those kind of histories. So the fact that it's happening now is just, it's just trauma, and we are triggered by that. The thing that remains, however, is the fact that these people used their words to glorify Ukraine and to celebrate its beauty and its, you know, persistence in how the country wants to live and the hope in the future. And those words will live on. So the hope that remains and the legacy that remains is not about destruction and a war narrative. It's about the fact that we now hold on to these words by Victoria and all these other poets and artists to say, this is what is left, and this is what we're going to hold on to bring in a brighter future, you know, and hoping that this will not keep happening.
I do think the outcome might be different, because I've become, you know, in the conversations, become more aware of what's called the executed Renaissance of the 1920s. And of course, knowledge of that, knowledge of the writers and their outputs, it's taken, you know, several decades for those to percolate through Ukraine, and there's still a job to be done there. But their legacy is starting to be known and appreciated outside of Ukraine. It was this blanket of amnesia which Russia was able to place over all of that culture. Will it be different
and
now?
there's I think there's the difference now is because back then, Russia still had this influence of kind of erasure. So everything that was a Ukrainian language, basically Russian. You know, this painting that was painted by Ukrainian, oh, and it's a Russian kind of painter. So there was still a bit of an iron kind of curtain around what Ukraine wanted to be. So everything was kind of kept quiet for a long time. I honestly think it took, I mean, it's been bubbling since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, but I think 2022 really changed the shape of how people referenced Ukraine and how younger generations are now saying, by the way, we're going to call our representatives, we're going to call, you know, the heads of museums, we are going to adjust how you refer to all of these artists, and we're going to rename them as Ukrainian. That hasn't happened before, not that I'm aware of. It was the first time that people my age and younger are saying, okay, we've had enough. Now, because of the dawn of the internet, now it's a very easy way to contact people and say, no, you need to shut this down because it's being upheld by some kind of Russian artist, or no, you need to change the name of this, or this is Ukrainian, this is Ukrainian. So we are rewriting, in a way, colonial history, and we are doing it in our voices, in the truth. We are representing Ukraine as it should be. You know, and that's the difference. I think, you know, back then in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, even when Ukraine kind of got independence, people still referred or deferred to Russia instead of Ukraine, you know. So I think now there's a turning point here. And yes, it's taken a lot of unfortunate and unconscionable deaths and people losing their loved ones and artists losing their lives, unfortunately. But now it's kind of completely shifted.
Well, absolutely hope that's the case. And I think the work you're doing with the team on the documentary, that is having a huge impact. It will have a further impact with the second anniversary coming up. And this is perfect timing to really get people, into that. Anyone watching this, I strongly encourage you, please do share the links, find out where this documentary is available in your region. I was able to download it. I had to pay, but I was able to download it on Amazon in preparation and watch it. As I say, it took 5 sittings to watch, but I think incredibly important to do that. And I'm sure people will find a way to watch it in their areas. PBS is the other website. We'll put all the links in the description here. But I think it's incredibly important what you're doing. I'm so appreciative of all that work and all of your colleagues as well. And of course, we need to do everything we can to shorten victory, to bring it sooner and make it more decisive so that more of these talented Ukrainian voices aren't silenced.
Absolutely. I agree. And I'm thank you always for allowing Ukrainian voices to share truth and to have a platform where you're open to having hard discussions, because I think, again, it's so easy to just turn away and shut people down. And I think the more we start listening to each other and learning from each other's perspectives, that hopefully will get Ukraine closer to victory and sooner. So here's hoping that this year everything will shift finally. So,
well, thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Дякую.